Hello, and thanks for joining me as I continue to paint the minis from Guards of Atlantis II. In this video I'm painting Mortimer from the new Wayward Heroes pack, and at least for this video I've sort of forgone my typical approach of a first stopping point and then some advanced extras. I wanted to focus more on just having fun painting the mini, going with the flow, and not worrying too much about having an exact game plan in mind. For model cleanup, as you'd expect from this somewhat two-dimensional pose, there's a mold line running up both sides of his overcoat. There's also a noticeable mold line on the top of the guitar body and continuing up the right arm, but that's more or less the extent of it. There's a mold line on the top of the hair as well, and some other small places, but those don't really seem too noticeable at all, and they blend in pretty well with the model's texture and the edges. The rest of the model prep is nothing new, just my standard light gray prime, followed with a heavy dry brush of pure white. And then it's on to adding some color. Like most Guards of Atlantis heroes, there is some variation in his depiction and the colors in the various art pieces on the different cards. I decided that I really like the bright green skin look and the sort of black to purple leather, so that's the general look I'm going with. I did decide to tie in some of the red accent colors a bit as well, but at the start of the paint job I was a bit undetermined on if I'd do that or not. But anyways, getting started, I picked this bright green ghoul green speed paint for all of the skin. The art shows a bluish gray sort of dead flesh color on the right arm, but since on the actual model barely any of his skin is actually really showing, I think it'll just read more clearly if it's all the same green color. Next I do a quick wet blend of a black and purple speed paint on the cloak, leathers, boots, and hair, putting the black in the shadows and the purple in the highlights. I paint this really roughly, it does not have to be perfect at all. Speed paint I've found is really good at self-leveling before it dries, so even where it looks a bit splotchy, it ends up actually blending and smoothing out pretty okay. I also barely do any actual blending back and forth with my brushes. Another advantage of speed paint is that the colors kind of blend together a bit when wet anyways, but they don't totally merge together. I've found at least that this helps keep the color transition pretty decent without a ton of work at all. Then I take my black speed paint color and base coat the whole guitar with that. And then just like on the leathers, I take these black and purple speed paint colors and use them to make a rough wet blend of colors on the hair. And then here's where I decide to tie in some of the red. I take a deep red speed paint color and I paint that on the pants and the red armband, as well as, you can do that on any other details that you want to make that red color as well. I did also get a little fancy, and I mixed some of that purple speed paint that's on my palette, and I mixed it into the red for color to apply in the shadows of these red areas, doing the same sort of wet blending the colors together. I picked out a brownish green color for the zombies he's stepping on, and then I picked a more neutral brown color and used that to paint all the planks on the base. Things are looking pretty good already, and everything has color now. I'm sure I don't need to keep repeating in every video that this is the way I like to do it, but I do really like at least having a color on every part of the model. Then I know more or less right away what colors work well and maybe what colors don't work so well, and then I know specifically which areas of the model need to look a lot more punchy and stand out a lot more. And obviously right now that's primarily the guitar, which kind of just looks black. And I decided, just for simplicity, that I'll just make the entire guitar look like a silver color. I've been having a lot of fun painting with non-metallic metal effects recently, so I'll do a basic job with that. Alternatively, since I'm anticipating that most people probably don't want to paint NMM effects on their board game minis, I think a single dry brush or highlight layer of metallic silver paint on these metals would look great as well. And it would be a lot easier to pull off, and probably take a lot less time as well. But anyway, for the silver colors on the guitar and on the rest of the minis, I keep the black or dark purplish black color in the recesses, and then I just work up through grays to white in several highlight layers. I start with this mix of Payne's gray and gray blue, and then I work up through the gray blue, and then eventually all the way up to a pure bold titanium white in the very brightest highlights. This isn't an award-winning NMM execution or anything, but I like how it looks, and I feel like it's also really good practice. And honestly, for this, I'm not doing anything super fancy. I'm not doing any, arduous glazing to get all these perfectly buttery smooth transitions. Honestly, I'm just kind of doing some rough highlights and then looks good enough to me. Moving on, the skin is looking pretty flat, so I move to that for highlights next. For this, I mixed a little bit of a pastel green acrylic color into my green speed paint, thinned it with some water, and used that for a couple of thin highlight layers. This actually works pretty well mixing acrylic highlight colors into speed paints. As long as you keep it fairly thin, it seems like it applies just fine. I moved on then to just doing a few highlights on the red colors, taking this really bold red and mixing in a little bit of an off-white color for some highlights. Next up is all of the dark purple and black leathers and boots and etc. And I highlighted those with this diluted blue-violet color, with a decent amount of glaze medium and a bit of water mixed in to make it fairly transparent, and then I did some scratchy and rough highlights. I did a second highlight pass where I mixed a little bit of white into this, and I tried to push the specular highlights pretty far, but not make them too extreme, because I kind of wanted to make this read like a semi-reflective shiny leather color. On the cloak, I painted very scratchy vertical line highlights, which hopefully also helps to imply this shiny leather surface. Then I dry brushed some bright pale green on the zombies on the base, and I used this dead flesh color and dry brushed it on the wood planks. As I mentioned before, I'm not really following the first stopping point method really closely for this mini, but I would say this is a pretty good place to call it if you don't want to futz with all of the little extra details and all the refining steps. But since I'm a tryhard, and also since I'm still having fun working on this mini, I keep on going further. The first of these extra steps will be painting all of the stitches on the pants and on the arm. For this, I use the same dead flesh color that I already had on my palette. When I'm applying this paint, I try to only catch the raised areas, and I try to avoid flooding the paint into the recesses. Then I apply a brown wash onto the stitches, just to really make them stand out. And while I have this brown wash out, I apply it to the zombies and parts of the base just to shade them down a little bit more. And while I'm waiting for this to dry, I'll shift on to painting other stuff. I did several passes of dry brushed highlights on the hair, starting with this magenta color, and mixing some white into it for a few of my consecutive? What's the word? After the first one, highlights. Then the brown wash was dry, so I went back to working on the stitches, just mixing some bright ivory into my dead flesh color, and using that for one or two extra highlights. It doesn't really matter exactly where you place these highlights on the stitches. I kind of just pick either the middle of the stitch or the top of the stitch to receive this little highlight layer, because I'm really more concerned just with having a gradient from dark color to light color on the stitch, rather than placing it in the exact most accurate spot. Trying to make some of the colors on the base look a little bit more cohesive now, I take the dead flesh color and I make a thick glaze of it, applying it to the zombies, trying to brighten them up a little bit and make them look a little bit more like dead skin than wood. I don't apply this glaze totally uniformly over all of the zombies. I kind of prioritize the highlight areas more and keep the shadows a little bit darker. With that done, I shift to doing some cleanup steps. First, fixing the overspill of red speed paint on the wrist bracelet where that sort of spilled onto the skin. Then I painted and layered up some red on the small pants section between the two leg bands on his leg, whatever you call those. And then I also decided to paint some regular brushed on highlights on his hair. Then I fixed some spots where I was a bit messy with the non-metallic metal effect with some black wash. I also used this in some spots around the mini to add some extra definition or clean up some sloppy highlights, like on the sort of ridges of the cloak, or between the red pants and the dark purple parts of the pants. I've kind of been putting it off a little bit, but now I decided it's time to turn my attention to the face, And I did also decide to try and replicate this sort of Kiss style face paint. I sketched out this sort of red triangular shapes on both sides of the face around the eyes, first with a dark red, and then highlighting it with a more vibrant red color. I used a fairly thinned down purple shadow color to paint the mouth, and then I painted pure white in the eyes, and then cleaned up the borders around this where I was a little bit messy. I think it still is a little bit messy, but I got it to a good enough for me sort of level. Now that those face details look good enough for me, I take that same purple shadow color from before, thin it with some glaze medium, and paint that into all of the shadow areas for the zombie skin. I especially use it around the arm where the stitches are, building it up in several passes, kind of trying to imply a dead and rotting flesh look around there. Also, when necessary, I do a little bit of re-highlighting with my pastel green color. Then I paint the base rim black, and at this point I realized I almost forgot about the Ankh symbol on the back of his overcoat thing. All I can see when I see this Ankh symbol is the gold Ankh from Spelunky, so I'm deciding to paint it gold. I layered quickly from this dark golden brown color, up through dead flesh, and then up to a bright ivory. Then, I used brown wash to clean up any of the sloppy borders a little bit. The raised sculpted details of the Ankh make it really easy for this brown wash to flow into all the recesses nicely. And that's where I'm calling it for Mortimer. I had a lot of fun painting this mini. The character is really enjoyable, and it gave me a chance to use some pretty fun color combos. Hopefully you also don't mind too much that I went with a non-metallic metal effect on all of those metal parts. And as always, let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next time. Take care of yourself, and I hope you have a great day.